In the quiet heart of Greywood, where the glow of Riverside Diner offers warmth against the chill of the night, a single moment of courage can shatter the grip of fear. Imagine a young woman, Darra Valen, standing behind the counter, her steady hands hiding a strength forged by years of grit and her father's unyielding lessons. When the Steel Vipers biker gang storms in, their laughter sharp and their threats heavy, they see her as just another target. But Darra is no ordinary waitress. As their leader's hand reaches for her, the air crackles with defiance. And what unfolds next will leave scars on the toughest gang in town and spark a fire of hope in a community ready to rise. Step into this story of resilience, where one woman's bravery becomes the heartbeat of a town rediscovering its strength. They swaggered into the Riverside Diner like it was theirs by right. The roar of engines had barely died down before the Steel Vipers stormed through the door. Leather, laughter, and aggression rolled into one loud, unwelcome entrance. They were ready to stir chaos, to intimidate and dominate. But this night, they miscalculated. They chose the wrong target. To them, Darra Valen was just another face behind the counter, another waitress to leer at, to needle, to kill into submission. They couldn't have known they were poking a flame beneath still waters. Their leader made the mistake first, putting his hand where it didn't belong. That's when it all shifted. In the space of a heartbeat, the entire room changed. Darra didn't hesitate. The calm in her blood turned to steel, her reflexes honed by a lifetime raised under the discipline of a Navy veteran. In that instant, her father's teachings lit up her body like muscle memory. Kestrel Ironwood hadn't raised a victim. He'd raised a warrior. Darra didn't shrink, didn't freeze. She moved with unshakable focus, each step, each action, measured and precise. The Steel Vipers weren't facing some frightened girl behind a coffee pot anymore. They were facing someone who had been trained to remain unbreakable under pressure. And they realized too late they were in the wrong place, facing the wrong woman. What happened inside those checkered walls would send tremors through the quiet town of Greywood for days, maybe longer. The toughest gang in the region walked into that diner thinking they owned it, and walked out with bruises they didn't bargain for. Some visible, others carved deeper. And Darra? Her strength didn't come from a uniform. It was etched into her soul, earned through a lifetime of discipline, endurance, and calm resolve. The Riverside Diner sat just beyond the bend of the old highway that twisted through Greywood, a small, tight-knit town nestled in the crook of the forested hills. For truckers, locals, and even the stray soul passing through, the diner was a glowing refuge. Checkerboard tile gleamed beneath the soft amber light of vintage pendants overhead. The walls bore sepia-toned memories, black and white snapshots of fishing trips, town parades, and wedding days gone by. The comforting aroma of brewed coffee mingled with the sweetness of fresh apple pie resting on the counter's edge. It was a place that welcomed you like an old friend. Behind the counter stood Darra Valen, methodically polishing a highball glass until it gleamed. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a clean ponytail, not a strand out of place, and her green eyes quietly swept the room with a calm vigilance. On the surface, she looked like any other waitress, graceful, kind, efficient, always with a ready smile. But beneath that calm exterior lived the legacy of Kestrel Ironwood, her father, her mentor, her anchor. A Navy hero who had taught her not just how to survive storms, but how to face them with poise. That night, the diner was peaceful. Low voices murmured over half-full mugs. Locals lingered in booths, sharing small-town stories. In a corner booth near the window, an older man sat alone, hands wrapped around a steaming cup. Darra recognized him without needing to look twice. Ian Thistledown, a retired sheriff's deputy and one of the diner's quiet constants. He came in most evenings, ordered the same plate, said little, and watched everything. Then came the sound that broke the stillness, the distant throb of motorcycle engines crawling over the asphalt. Darra's hand paused mid-polish. The rim of the glass caught a glint from the overhead light as she turned toward the window. Her entire posture shifted, alert, listening. The engines grew louder, swelling into a mechanical snarl that reverberated through the windows. From the kitchen doorway, Celine Blackwater peeked out, her usually warm face drawn and tight with concern. "Steel vipers," she whispered, her voice nearly lost beneath the rumbling crescendo. The name was enough. It turned conversation into silence. The easy comfort in the diner evaporated into a thick, anxious hush. Everyone knew who the Steel Vipers were. In Greywood, they weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat. A gang known for pushing people around, feeding off fear, and testing limits. Darra set the glass down slowly and straightened her shoulders. Her expression was unreadable. The door slammed open with a jarring clang. The Steel Vipers spilled in like they owned the place. Black leather jackets adorned with the signature coiled viper insignia glinted under the diner lights. At the head strode Cassian Braden, broad, cocky, and wearing a smile that dared you to challenge him. His dark eyes raked across the room and stopped just long enough on Darra to make his intentions clear. "Evening," he said with a smug drawl, his voice polished with false charm. The rest of the gang fanned out behind him, sprawling into booths and stools like it was their personal clubhouse. The air grew heavy with the acrid scent of gasoline and stale cigarette smoke, clashing with the comforting aromas that had filled the diner moments ago. Darra tightened her jaw but moved fluidly toward the coffee pot. Her steps were steady, her demeanor unchanged. She'd faced worse than swaggering bikers, and she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. Cassian claimed a stool at the counter, the creak of leather marking his every move. He leaned forward with lazy arrogance, resting his elbows on the counter. His stare was deliberate, and his smirk widened as Darra approached. "Well, aren't you something?" he said, tilting his head to study her. His voice tried to play a charm, but the undercurrent was pure condescension. Darra met his gaze squarely, her expression calm as ever. "Coffee-in?" she asked, voice polite but frost-edged. Cassian chuckled, the sound low and slow. "Sure, sweetheart. Keep it coming. Been a long ride." He tapped the counter with one ringed finger, the metallic clink loud in the quiet space. She poured without a tremor, every motion graceful and precise. Just then, another biker, Lyric Mahaven, tilted back in his chair, balancing it on two legs like a teenager daring gravity. "So," he grinned, yellow teeth bared, "what's a pretty little thing like you doing in a dump like this?" Before Darra could even react, Tobias Oakenshield, another of the gang, reached across the counter, grabbed the sugar shaker, and deliberately knocked it over. Crystals spilled in a slow cascade across the pristine counter. "Oops," he said, his grin unapologetic. The others burst into raucous laughter, the sound scraping against the tension that had settled like dust on every surface. Darra's hand closed around a clean rag. She moved to clean the mess without a word, her composure ironclad. She didn't take the bait, wouldn't give them the show they wanted. Cassian leaned closer, eyes glittering. "You don't talk much, huh?" he prodded. Darra paused, her hand stilling on the counter. She looked him straight in the eye. "I'm here to serve coffee," she said, each word clipped and cool. That landed. The laughter faltered for just a second, a ripple of uncertainty passing among the gang. Cassian's smile curved into something sharper, more intrigued than amused. "Feisty," he muttered. "I like that." In the far booth, Ian Thistledown shifted. His weathered hands gripped his mug a little tighter. His eyes flicked to Darra, worried, but he didn't move. Not yet. Drawing attention to himself could escalate things fast. Behind the counter, Celine Blackwater stood frozen, hands wringing nervously, torn between fear and the urge to step in. But the way Cassian's stare pinned Darra and the way Darra didn't flinch kept her rooted to the floor. As the heavy presence of the Steel Vipers loomed over the diner like a storm cloud, Darra kept her body moving out of habit, her senses on high alert. Each step she took was measured, composed, but her awareness never left the gang seated nearby. When she passed Tobias Oakenshield on her way to refill another patron's coffee, he shifted subtly, his foot jutting into her path. She didn't stumble, but had to lift her leg and step over it. "Careful now," he said with a smirk that dripped with mock innocence. The atmosphere in the diner was stifling, every breath of air laced with tension. The usual chatter and clinking of utensils had vanished. Other customers kept their eyes firmly on their meals, their faces lowered, avoiding the gang like prey, pretending not to be seen. Darra didn't waver. She walked calmly back behind the counter, placed the coffee pot down with a clear, deliberate click, and lifted her eyes to meet Cassian Braden's. "Anything else?" she asked, voice even, yet with a subtle edge that dared him to push further. Cassian's lips curved in a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He seemed both amused and slightly annoyed by her refusal to flinch. "Not yet," he replied, his voice dipped in challenge, every syllable dragging tension tighter around the room like a tightening wire. The silent standoff was palpable, like static before a lightning strike. Darra broke the moment, gliding away toward another table. Her hands remained steady as she poured coffee for a couple in their 40s who refused to look at her, visibly uncomfortable in the thick cloud of unease that clung to the diner. Behind her, the vipers filled the silence with guttural laughs and low jeers, their voices cutting through the room like knives. At the counter, Tobias toyed with a fork, spinning it between his fingers like a blade before letting it fall to the floor with a metallic clatter. "Hey, waitress!" he called out, leaning back on his stool, his voice oily with provocation. "I dropped something. Mind picking it up for me?" Darra paused, her hand tightening just slightly around the handle of the coffee pot. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression calm, neutral, but her green eyes were sharp as glass. "I think you can manage that yourself," she said, her voice controlled but unmistakably firm. The gang exploded in laughter, slapping Tobias on the back like he'd just been the punchline of a good joke. "Well, would you look at that?" Lyric Mohaven sneered, popping a peanut into his mouth and crunching it noisily. "Looks like she's got some bite. Must get it from her old man," Tobias added, flashing a smirk that earned him another round of guffaws. Darra's face remained composed, unmoved, but inside something stirred. A spark. The mention of her father, Kestrel Ironwood, sent a pulse of heat down her spine. She drew in a deep, measured breath, summoning his voice in her head. "Stay calm. Stay in control. Always." Cassian's eyes followed her every move. His smirk deepened. "I don't think she likes us, boys," he said, feigning hurt. "Maybe we're not charming enough." He rapped his knuckles on the counter. The sound was casual, but his eyes never left hers. "How about some service, sweetheart? I could use a refill." Without a word, Darra returned to the counter and refilled his cup. The other vipers leaned in, emboldened by her silence, their faces lit with the glee of predators who smell blood. "Careful, Cassian," came a voice from the far end of the counter. Soren Whitlock, her arms crossed, met his gaze with a teasing smile that barely masked the warning in her eyes. "You might scare her off." Cassian let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Not a chance, boss." The door to the diner jingled open. Everyone turned. Ian Thistledown entered, a man shaped by years and weather, his old coat draped over one arm, a paper bag in the other. He hesitated at the door, taking in the room's strange quiet and the gang's looming presence, then walked to his usual booth with practiced ease. "Evening, Ian," Darra greeted softly, bringing him his regular, black coffee, no sugar. "Evening, Darra," he replied, voice low but steady. He glanced at the bikers, his jaw tightening, and offered her a reassuring nod. Tobias's voice rang out again, this time louder and meaner. "Old man looks nervous." "Maybe he thinks we'll take his seat next," Lyric added, drawing another snicker from the others. Darra straightened. She laid a gentle hand on Ian's shoulder. "Don't mind them," she said in a low voice, before heading back toward the counter. Cassian leaned forward on his elbows, eyes pinned to her. His voice lowered, almost intimate but still edged with danger. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said. "Most folks would be trembling by now." She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed an empty tray and walked to the back to grab a fresh pot of coffee. Her steps were smooth, but inside her thoughts spun. They were testing her, looking for weakness, probing her edges like wolves circling a lone doe. Behind the counter, Celine Blackwater wrung her hands, her worry etched in every line of her face. "Darra," she whispered as the waitress passed. "Maybe we should call the sheriff." "They haven't done anything yet," Darra replied under her breath, voice quiet but unshakable. "Let's not escalate this." Celine glanced anxiously at the gang, her face pale. "Just be careful," she murmured. As Darra returned with the tray, Tobias reached for a roll of napkins and tossed it underhand toward her feet. It unraveled midair, spilling across the floor like a challenge. "Oops," he said, his voice syrupy sweet. Another spill. The laughter that followed was sharp, cruel, razor-edged. Darra crouched to pick up the napkins, her movements slow, deliberate, every motion intentional, every breath counted. "You're really patient, aren't you?" Lyric mocked, watching her with lazy amusement. "I'd have cracked by now." "She's got nerves of steel," Cassian said, feigning admiration. "Or maybe she's just too scared to fight back." Darra stood, the napkins now crumpled in her fist. Her green eyes burned steady into Cassian's, unflinching. "Is there something you need?" she asked, voice low, firm, stripped of all pretense. Cassian's smirk twitched again, just barely. The diner's background noise dulled to a hush. He stared at her like a man sizing up a rival. "Yeah," he finally said. His voice dropped to a darker register. "How about another round for the boys, on the house?" The words hung there, heavy, like smoke curling from a fuse. Darra's eyes flicked towards Celine, who shook her head almost imperceptibly, her face stricken with fear. "Sorry," Darra said, turning back. "We don't do freebies." Cassian's jaw stiffened, and the mood in the room shifted like a sudden drop in pressure. The biker's laughter died. Grins turned into tight lines. "You sure about that?" Cassian asked. Quiet now, voice brittle. "Very," Darra answered, her tone calm and immovable. Her restraint, her strength, it only seemed to provoke him more. Cassian leaned back on his stool, tapping a finger against the counter in an uneven rhythm. A twisted smile tugged at his lips. The rest of the Vipers fell silent. They were waiting, anticipating his next move. "Boys," Cassian said, his voice cracking the tension like a whip, "I think our dear waitress here needs a little reminder of what respect looks like." Tobias stood immediately, his chair scraping across the tile with a jarring screech. Slowly, purposefully, he walked to a booth near the window where a young couple sat huddled in fear. He knocked lightly on the table with his knuckles. Smile wide, dangerous. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, falsely polite. The couple froze, their faces turned toward Darra with would-a pleading eyes. She set the coffee pot down and stepped forward. Her voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "Leave them." Tobias turned toward her, pretending to be surprised, his voice dripping with mockery. "Relax, sweetheart. Just making conversation." Without waiting for a response, he leaned over and snatched the young man's water glass, taking a long, deliberate sip before slamming it down onto the table. The impact sent water splashing over the rim, soaking the table and both the couple's hands. The woman gasped softly, recoiling, while the man's jaw tensed, his fists curled tight beneath the table. But he said nothing. Darra's gaze flicked to Cassian, who lounged with an air of bored superiority, smirking wider as if entertained by the tension his gang had created. "That's enough," Darra said, her voice sharp, cutting through the simmering tension like a blade. Tobias slowly straightened, his grin dimming as he studied her, taking a step forward. "You gonna make me stop?" he taunted, closing the gap between them. The diner held its breath. Every eye shifted to Darra, but she didn't back down. She stood tall, lifted her chin slightly, and took a step forward of her own, her voice steady, quiet, but immovable. "Yes." For a beat, Tobias paused, taken off guard by the certainty in her voice. His bravado flickered, and he glanced toward Cassian, looking for guidance. Cassian let out a lazy chuckle, shaking his head. "Easy, Tobias. Don't want to scare off the customers too much." Tobias muttered something under his breath, but obeyed, retreating to his seat with a sullen glare. Darra didn't move. Her eyes stayed locked on Cassian. "Impressive," Cassian drawled, the smirk never leaving his face. "You've got guts. I'll give to that." "I've had practice," Darra replied calmly, her words heavy with meaning. The weight of her experience, her discipline, everything her father had taught her, settled in the space between them. From the edge of the group, Soren Whitlock had been watching quietly, her arms crossed, leaning back slightly in her chair. She finally spoke, her voice firm but level. "Cassian, maybe we've made our point. No need to keep dragging this out." Cassian's smirk faltered as his eyes slid toward her. "You going soft on me, Soren?" "Just saying," she replied coolly, lifting one shoulder in a slight shrug. "We've got better things to do than harass waitresses all night." Cassian's jaw flexed, but before he could retort, the bell above the diner door jingled. Everyone turned as Sheriff Orla Frost Hollow stepped through the doorway. Her eyes swept the room, sharp, unblinking, immediately absorbing every detail of the scene. The air shifted once again. The steel vipers straightened in their seats, their bravado momentarily checked by her presence. Her gaze settled first on Darra, then moved deliberately to Cassian. "Evening," she said, her voice calm but carrying authority. "Everything all right in here?" Cassian's grin returned, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Sheriff. Just having a little friendly chat." Orly didn't respond right away. Her eyes lingered on Darra, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, enough to indicate she had things under control for now. "Well then," Orly said, the steel in her tone unmistakable. "Let's make sure it stays that way." Cassian held her gaze for a long second before raising both hands in mock surrender. "You've got it, Sheriff. No trouble here." With a final look around the room, Orl stepped back out the door. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken warnings and unresolved tension. Darra exhaled quietly. She knew the sheriff's arrival had bought them a temporary peace, but it wouldn't last. Not with men like Cassian Braden. The steel vipers eventually left the diner, their boots stomping, their voices low. Sheriff Orla watched from her patrol car as their motorcycles roared into the night. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a pause, a recalibration. Cassian Braden's smirk vanished as they sped down the highway. In its place, something colder took root, a resolve born of wounded pride and bruised authority. He had been challenged, humiliated not only by Darra Valen, but by his own crew's hesitation, by Sauron's quiet dissent. Back at Black Ridge Hollow, their makeshift hideout tucked deep in the woods, Cassian dismounted in a sharp, purposeful motion. Gravel crunched under his boots as he turned to face the others, eyes burning. "That waitress thinks she can stand up to us," he said, his voice low and tight with fury. "She made us look weak." Tobias Oakenshield, still riled from earlier, stepped forward, fists clenched. "We should have put her in her place right then and there." Cassian's glare cut to him like a knife. "And get ourselves locked up by the sheriff?" he snapped. "No, we don't hit back like amateurs. We do this smart." Sauron leaned casually against her bike, her arms crossed, her voice skeptical. "Smart or excessive?" she asked, eyeing him. "It's a diner, Cassian, not a war zone." Cassian's expression darkened. "You saw the way she looked at me. That wasn't fear. That was defiance. If we let that slide, it spreads. This is about respect." Sauron didn't answer. Her face gave nothing away, but tension rippled through the group. Lyric Mohavin, ever the provocateur, grinned wickedly. "So what's the plan, boss? Teach her a little lesson she won't forget?" Cassian's smirk returned, colder than before. "Exactly." Back at the Riverside Diner, Darra sat alone at the counter. The place was empty now. Outside, the neon sign buzzed softly, casting a pale glow against the windows. Inside, the weight of the evening clung to the air. She replayed the encounter in her mind, every gesture, every word. Her father's teachings came back to her in waves, lessons ingrained from years of discipline. Anticipate, prepare, act with purpose. Kestrel Ironwood's voice was still with her, as constant as her heartbeat. She knew Cassian wasn't done. The steel vipers wouldn't just let this go. Celine Blackwater stepped quietly out from the kitchen, her face pale, her worry clear. "You should go home, Dar," she said softly. "I will," Darra replied, though her thoughts were already somewhere else. Home wasn't a retreat, it was preparation. Later that night, after locking up, Darra drove to her small house at the edge of town. The porch light flickered as she stepped inside. She moved straight to the hallway closet, pulled out a locked metal box, and carried it to the table. Inside, she revealed what she had kept hidden, prepared for a moment she hoped would never come. A Navy-issued knife, a tactical flashlight, and a pair of reinforced gloves. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she understood the importance of being ready. She slid the knife into a sheath on her belt, her movements deliberate. In her mind, she heard her father's voice again. "Stay ahead of them, Draw." She repeated the words aloud, a promise to herself. The next morning, Darra moved with purpose. Her first stop was the hardware store, Extra locks, thick chains, a can of pepper spray. Small things that added up to security. Then she headed for a familiar porch where Ian Thistledown sat whittling wood, as he often did. The former deputy looked up at her approach, squinting against the morning sun. "Knew you'd come by," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I need your help," Darra said plainly, without preamble. Ian Thistledown didn't answer right away. He studied her in silence, his calloused fingers resting on the small piece of wood he'd been carving. Though he rarely spoke of his past, Darra knew enough. He had once worn a deputy's badge and had weathered the storms of Greywood's lawless years. Now retired, he might have traded his patrol car for a porch chair, but the sharpness in his gaze remained untouched by time. "What kind of help are you asking for?" he finally asked, laying the wood and knife gently on the porch railing. Darra hesitated, just for a beat. "Advice. The steel vipers won't back off. I can feel it. And I need to be ready when they come back." Ian nodded, his expression unreadable but pensive. "You're smart to prepare. Cassian Braden doesn't let go of a grudge easily." He motioned to a chair beside him. "Sit. We've got half an hour. Let's use it." Over the next stretch of quiet conversation, Ian outlined a series of practical, grounded steps. He didn't sugarcoat things. He talked about reinforcing every door and window in the diner, adding extra locks and physical barriers. He pointed out how motion sensor lights could be used to cut down on blind spots. And he told her to keep the sheriff's number where she could grab it at a moment's notice. But his most powerful piece of advice wasn't about hardware. It was about mindset. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low, steady like a steady tide. "Cassian feeds off fear. The moment you show him you're not afraid, that's when he starts to stumble." Darra listened closely, drawing strength from his measured tone. When she finally left Ian's porch, she felt something shift inside her, more focused, more deliberate. She spent the rest of the day putting his advice into action. Back at the diner, she installed the locks she'd purchased earlier and mounted motion-activated lights around the building's exterior. At home, she opened her emergency contacts list and reviewed every name, rehearsing different scenarios in her head. What to do, what to say, how to move, how not to panic. But while she was preparing, the Steel Vipers were already on the move. At Black Ridge Hollow, Cassian Braden sat at a battered wooden table with his gang arrayed around him. The map of Greywood lay sprawled open before them, a bold circle inked thick around one location, Riverside Diner. "We start slow," Kishin said, tapping the circle with 2 fingers. "Make her sweat. Let her feel the eyes. Remind her whose town this really is." Tobias Oakenshield leaned forward, the grin on his face savage with anticipation. "So, what's the play?" Cassian's smile returned, cool, calculated. "Simple. We don't hit her, we haunt her. Show up, lurk around, leave a little something behind to get in her head." That evening, Darra caught the first signal that the game had begun. She was driving home from the diner when a single motorcycle's headlight appeared in her rearview mirror. It followed at a precise, unsettling distance. Not too close, not too far. Just enough to be noticed. She kept her eyes forward, her hands firm on the wheel, refusing to look back. But the muscles in her forearms were tight with tension. The bike followed her all the way to her driveway. There, it paused for a beat, revved once, loudly, then peeled off into the darkness, vanishing as suddenly as it had arrived. The next morning, Darra walked up to the diner and stopped dead in her tracks. A large, crude image had been spray-painted across the front window. A coiled viper, its fangs bared, winding through blocky red letters that read, "See you soon." Celine Blackwater let out a sharp gasp behind her, her face blanching. "This is bad, Darra," she whispered, her voice trembling. Darra's jaw clenched. Her expression stayed steady. "It's just paint," she said evenly, picking up a bucket of soapy water and a brush. "It won't last." As she scrubbed away the graffiti, she could feel the town watching her. Some passers-by turned away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Others lingered at a distance, their faces taut with a mix of pity and fear. Inside, Darra repeated Aeon's words to herself like a mantra. Stay calm, stay in control. She knew exactly what the Vipers wanted, to break her composure, to plant fear like a seed and watch it grow. She wouldn't let them. But as night fell and the diner emptied out, the quiet returned with a tension she couldn't ignore. Just as she locked the front door, she heard the distant, unmistakable growl of motorcycle engines. Her heart beat harder, but her breathing stayed even. She turned toward the sound. She couldn't see them, but she knew. They were out there, watching, waiting, like wolves circling the edges of a campfire. The town had gone still, as though Greywood itself was holding its breath. No voices, no traffic. Even the wind seemed hesitant. Something was coming. Inside the dim diner, Darra stood behind the counter, her green eyes flicking toward the windows. The motion lights outside flickered on, then off again, throwing long, warped shadows across the walls. Celine hovered near the kitchen entrance, wringing her hands. "Darra, are you sure about this?" she asked, barely more than a whisper. Darra nodded once. Calm, steady. "They'll come. I'd rather meet them here, on my terms, than let them keep this town in fear." The bell above the door jingled suddenly. Both women tensed. But it wasn't a gang member, it was Ian Thistledown. His silhouette was framed in the yellow porch light. He stepped in with the same slow purpose he always had, face grim and jaw set. "Figured you might need an extra pair of eyes tonight," he said, taking a seat at the counter. Darra gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Aeon." Before either of them could say more, the sound returned. Not distant now, but near, growing louder by the second. The roar of motorcycles filled the air, thick and threatening, like a storm about to burst. One by one, they rolled into the parking lot, headlights slicing through the darkness, engines idling low, rumbling like growls in a beast's throat. Cassie and Braden dismounted first. Every movement deliberate, confident, meant to dominate the space before he even stepped inside. Behind him came Tobias Oakenshield and Lyric Mohaven, both sneering with expectation. Saren Whitlock stayed near the back, her expression shadowed, unreadable. Darra inhaled slowly. Anticipate, prepare, act with purpose. Her father's words rang clearly in her mind. The door burst open, the clang echoing off the walls. Cassian strode in, his boots heavy on the tile. His eyes swept the room like a searchlight, landing on Darra, and his smirk widened. "Evening, sweetheart," he drawled, voice thick with mockery. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." Darra stepped out from behind the counter. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. "What do you want, Cassian?" she asked, voice level, tone sharp with controlled steel. Cassian chuckled, waving the others in. "What do you think we want?" "Just a little friendly conversation." Tobias grabbed a chair, spun it backward, and straddled it, his grin feral. "Nice place you've got here," he said. "Be a shame if something happened to it." Celine edged farther into the kitchen, her fear plain, but Darra didn't move. She stood tall, unshaken. "You've made your point," she said. "Now it's time to go." Cassian's grin faltered just for a moment. Behind the smug exterior, something dark flickered. "You're awful brave for someone standing alone." Darra's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I've faced worse," she said sharply. Her words drew harsh, mocking laughter from the bikers. The sound scraped against the air like metal on pavement. Cassian Braden stepped forward, his expression narrowing into a scowl. "You really think you can stop us?" Darra didn't respond right away. Calmly, with a practiced motion, she reached beneath the counter and retrieved the tactical flashlight she had stashed there earlier. With a swift flick, she turned it on, the powerful beam slicing across the dimly lit diner, catching the bikers full in the face. They recoiled, cursing and blinking as the sudden light seared their eyes. Taking advantage of the chaos, Darra pulled a canister of pepper spray from the loop on her belt and held it firmly in her hand, ready to use. Her voice rang out, low but unyielding. "Last chance. Get out." Cassian wiped at his watering eyes, his face contorting with rage. "You're going to read it," he growled. The heat in the diner rose, not from the weather but from the fury simmering beneath every breath and glance. The steel vipers shifted their stances, fanning out with slow, menacing intent, like wolves encircling a target. Cassian leaned against the counter, regaining some of his earlier swagger. A smug smile tugged at his lips as he stared at Darra, measuring her. Behind him, his crew loitered, tense and watchful, waiting for the slightest cue to strike. Darra didn't flinch. her green eyes locked onto Cassian's, unwavering. On the outside, she was the picture of composure. But inside, her thoughts were racing, evaluating each movement, each potential threat. She knew she was outnumbered, that this could tip into violence in a heartbeat. But she also knew showing fear would only embolden them. "You've got guts," Cassian sneered, the mockery in his voice unmistakable. "I'll give you that, but guts won't get you far." Tobias Oakenshield, ever eager for conflict, grabbed a glass off a nearby table and hurled it to the ground. The sharp crack of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot. From behind the kitchen door, Celine Blackwater flinched visibly, her pale face appearing for a split second as fear gripped her. "Oops," Tobias said, spreading his arms like it had been an accident. "Guess I'm a bit clumsy." Darra's eyes flicked to the broken glass and then returned to Cassian, her expression unchanged. "Clean it up," she said firmly. The room erupted into laughter. "You hear that, Cassian?" Lyric Mahaven jeered, slapping his palm on the counter. "She thinks she's running the place." Cassian's smile widened, but his eyes darkened. He stepped forward, his presence looming over her. "Why don't you clean it up for me, sweetheart?" Her heart thundered in her chest, but her body didn't move. Her father's voice echoed through her memory, calm and steady. "Control the situation. Don't let it control you." "I'm not here to clean up after you," she said, her voice clear and controlled. "And I'm not here to play games. Leave, now, before this gets worse for you." A heavy silence settled over the diner. For a moment, even Cassian looked thrown by her boldness. Then the smirk returned, colder than before. "Worse for me?" he echoed, each word dripping sarcasm. "You're funny. Let me show you what worse looks like." He lunged toward her, but Darra was already moving. Anticipating his aggression, she sidestepped and twisted his arm behind his back in one fluid motion, slamming it against the counter. Cassian let out a pained grunt as she pinned him down. The rest of the gang surged forward, but Darra was ready. She pulled the flashlight from her belt and shone it directly into their faces. The brilliant beam stunned them again, Tobias stumbling backward with a curse, Lyric throwing an arm over his face. Cassian fought her grip, but Darra held steady. Her voice cracked like a whip. "Enough! This ends here." From the back of the diner, Soren Whitlock stepped forward at last. Her expression was tight, her inner conflict obvious. "Cassian, maybe it's time to back off," she said. Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Cassian snarled at her. "Stay out of this, Soren." But she stood her ground, her eyes shifting from Darra to the others in the gang. The atmosphere shifted subtly. The crew was starting to hesitate, doubt creeping into their eyes. Their leader no longer looked untouchable. Darra released Cassian and stepped back, ready for anything. "You've got two choices," she said, her voice even and commanding. "Walk out of here now, or see what happens if you don't." No one moved. Cassian straightened slowly, his face a storm of rage. But he didn't strike again. Instead, he jerked his head toward the door. "This isn't over," he spat, venom lacing his words. One by one, the steel vipers filed out, their bravado cracked but not broken. Engines roared outside as they mounted their bikes and peeled into the night. Only then did Darra exhale, her breath slow and deliberate. Her muscles remained taut, hands still gripping the pepper spray tightly, adrenaline flooding her system. Behind her, Celine emerged from the kitchen. Her face was pale but full of admiration. Dar, I don't know how you did that," she whispered. Darra turned to her, the faintest smile breaking across her lips. "You don't back down to bullies," she said simply. Ian Thistledown, who had been sitting quietly through the entire confrontation, lifted his coffee mug in silent approval. The incident sent shockwaves through Greywood. For years, the Steel of Vipers had roamed unchecked, their dominance unchallenged. But now, people spoke in hushed but excited tones about what had happened at the Riverside Diner. Darra Valen, the quiet waitress, had stood up to them and sent them packing. A shift stirred through the town. For the first time in a long while, people began to feel safer, stronger. Regulars returned to the diner not just for food, but to see the woman who had faced down fear and won. Even Celine, long timid and wary, found new purpose. She had a reinforced door installed, cameras mounted at each corner of the diner, a silent acknowledgement of Darra's strength. One afternoon, as Darra wiped down the counter, Aane approached her. He placed his weathered hand gently on her shoulder. "You didn't just stand up to those bikers," he said, his voice steady, resonant. "You reminded this town we don't have to live in fear." Darra offered a quiet, grateful smile. "I just did what I had to," she replied. But deep down, she knew something had shifted inside her, something fierce and clear that had lain dormant too long. Meanwhile, the Steel Vipers, humbled and humiliated, retreated to lick their wounds. Cassian Braden was still burning with anger, his ego wounded by the events that had unfolded. Though he had left the diner with venomous threats on his lips, the Steel Vipers had all but vanished in the weeks that followed. Rumors swirled through the town like autumn wind, whispering that Soren Whitlock had left the gang entirely. Her retreat during the confrontation had been subtle, almost imperceptible, but now it seemed clear. It had been the first step toward her breaking free. Outwardly, things had grown quiet, but Darra Valen didn't let herself relax. She knew better. Beneath the stillness, she felt the potential for danger lingering like a storm cloud just beyond the horizon. She stayed vigilant, reinforcing the locks on her doors and making sure every window was secure. The diner, too, received extra care, a bolstered sense of safety for the place she called both workplace and refuge. Yet as time passed, a slow calm began to settle in. Days bled into weeks, and with each one, the tension in Darra's chest eased ever so slightly. One evening, as the sun melted into gold and amber along the rooftops of Greywood, she sat alone on her porch, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. The chirp of crickets whispered through the fading light, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Darra allowed herself to exhale fully, letting her shoulders drop. A breeze drifted across her skin, gentle and unthreatening. Her thoughts wandered to her father, Kestrel Ironwood, the man who had raised her with unwavering strength and a steady hand. She could picture him clearly, standing in their modest kitchen, the warmth of the stove casting soft shadows on the walls. He had told her once, voice low and even, "Courage isn't about not being afraid, Dare. It's doing the right thing even when the fear's still there." That memory stayed with her, more vivid now than ever before. She had faced her fear. She had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for the whole town of Greywood. She had defended the diner, the people, the very sense of peace that had begun to slip from them, and somehow that defiance had ignited something. The town, once shrouded in unease, began to feel lighter. Suspicion faded into hope, and the silence once filled with anxiety turned into the murmur of cautious optimism. The Riverside Diner, once simply a spot for a quick bite, transformed into something more, a symbol of resilience, a gathering place not just for meals, but for stories, for laughter, for connection. Darra noticed it in small ways first. Customers lingered over their coffee, drawn to the soft hum of conversation and the warm lights. Children returned with their families, tugging their parents by the hand, pointing to the very spot where Miss Darra had faced down the bikers. Even Eon Thistledown, the old deputy who never missed a morning visit, seemed more relaxed. He arrived earlier now, content to sit at the counter and share pieces of his past with Darra as she poured his coffee. One morning, he looked at her with quiet pride and said, "Funny, isn't it, how one act of courage can echo through a whole town? People are walking a little taller because of you." Darra smiled, brushing off the praise. "I didn't do it alone," she replied. "The town's always had this strength. We just forgot it for a while." Still, she couldn't ignore what had changed. She understood the role she now played, not as a hero, but as a spark. So she leaned in. After the last dish was dried each night, Darra stayed late to host self-defense workshops in the diner's back room. She taught simple techniques, lessons passed down from Kestrel. At first, only a few people showed up, teenagers curious about fighting and parents afraid for their families. But soon, the crowd grew. Word spread. The diner lights stayed on longer, illuminating a space where people of all ages learned not just how to defend themselves, but how to reclaim their confidence. Celine Blackwater was one of the first to join. Though her movements were awkward at first, her spirit never wavered. "I'm tired of feeling helpless," she confessed one night, wiping sweat from her brow, cheeks flushed. "If you can face them, so can I." Darra saw a new fire in her eyes, an echo of the fire Kestrel had seen in her own when she was younger. The ripple widened. Local businesses began contributing. The hardware store donated materials for homemade tools. The community center offered a larger space when the diner became too cramped. Darra had sparked something she could no longer contain, and she didn't want to. Then, one quiet afternoon, Soren Whitlock walked through the diner's door. Darra's breath caught, not in fear, but in surprise. Soren looked different. Gone was the biker's armor, the harsh leather replaced by a soft, worn hoodie. Her posture was still guarded, but her eyes were clearer, less defiant, more human. "I owe you an apology," she said, voice low but steady. "I should have spoken up, but I stayed silent when it mattered. Watching you, you reminded me that it's not too late to make it right." Darra studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "It's not," she answered. Soren asked to help with the workshops, and though some were hesitant at first, her honesty slowly broke down their skepticism. Her insight into the gang, their tactics, their mindset became an invaluable resource. What had once divided them now quietly stitched them back together. And Greywood healed. The diner, with its checkered floors and soft golden light, stood at the center of this slow but sure transformation. People came not only for food, but for a sense of safety, of belonging. Darra had helped the town find its footing again, one day, one story, one lesson at a time. Time passed, seasons turned. Greywood learned how to live without fear. The town's strength wasn't loud. It was quiet, enduring, resilient. And Darra, she too had changed. The events at the diner had forced her to look inward, to confront doubts she had long carried. She emerged stronger, steadier, and for the first time, perhaps ever, at peace with herself. One evening back on her porch, the crickets singing again in the dusk, she gazed out over the familiar streets of Greywood. The air was warm, filled with the distant laughter of a neighbor's child, and Darra found herself remembering her father's voice again. "You've got to trust yourself, Darra," Kestrel had once told her. "The world will test you, but you've got what it takes to meet it head on." She smiled softly, letting those words settle over her like a quilt. For so long, she'd questioned whether she could carry the weight of his legacy. But the moment with the Steel Vipers had revealed the truth. Courage didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it was small, deliberate. Sometimes it looked like staying late after work to teach a stranger how to punch. Sometimes it meant showing up, and sometimes it simply meant not giving in. The diner thrived. Families filled its booths, their conversations and laughter rising with the steam of fresh coffee. Celine moved with grace now, her nervous edges smoothed by resolve. Even Ian's rough voice held a lilt of contentment. The workshops grew, reaching new towns, new people, new hearts. And Soren Whitlock, once a ghost from a darker time, had become an anchor in the very community she had once helped to intimidate. She earned her place not with force, but with quiet effort and steady humility. Together they were reshaping Greywood, not into something new, but into what it had always had the potential to be. As Darra was locking up the diner for the night, wiping down the last counter and checking that all was in order, a soft voice broke the quiet hum of the empty place. A young girl no older than 10 approached her hesitantly, clutching a small, worn notebook tightly to her chest. Her eyes were bright with admiration, and though her voice wavered, her words were full of sincerity. "Miss Darra," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "my dad told me you're really brave. I want to be brave like you someday." Darra felt something shift deep inside her. She knelt down slowly so she could look the girl in the eye, grounding herself in the moment. There was something sacred in the way the child's innocence met the harsh truths of the world so gently. "Being brave doesn't mean you're never scared," she said softly, her tone warm and even. "It just means you don't let the fear stop you from doing what's right." The girl's face lit up with a radiant, almost luminous smile, one of those rare expressions that blooms straight from the heart. In that fleeting instant, Darra saw something take root in the child's spirit. Courage, confidence, and hope, sparked not by grand speeches or heroic deeds, but by honesty and quiet strength. As Darra rose to her feet, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders, she was struck by an unexpected feeling. The town, Greywood, with its fractured past and rough edges, had slowly, quietly given something back to her. Trust, a sense of belonging, a kind of hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. Greywood wasn't a perfect town. It carried its own scars and always would. The damage the steel vipers had done still lingered like the faded outlines of an old bruise. But the people, they had changed. They had come together piece by piece, moment by moment, and in that process become something stronger, more whole, more human. The diner wasn't just a building with chip counters and a humming refrigerator anymore. It had become something sacred, a place of refuge, connection, and quiet resilience. It was her home now, not just where she worked, but where she belonged, where she'd rediscovered who she was and who she wanted to be. And more than that, it had become the center of a small circle of souls who stood beside her. People who believed, fought, and healed alongside her. As she flicked off the last of the overhead lights and turned the key in the lock, Darra felt a calm, steady peace settle over her like a warm blanket. It was the kind of peace that didn't come from victory, but from surviving, from choosing to stay, from refusing to give in. Greywood's future still held its share of storms, but now it felt rooted in something real, something solid. Not in the absence of fear or pain, but in the courage to keep showing up anyway, to keep building, even on broken ground. And Darra Valen knew, as surely as the stars overhead, that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Her story, woven with quiet resolve and a strength born from hardship, had helped shape not only a place, but its people. The Riverside Diner had been transformed, not through force, but through faith, through presence, through her. Her courage had echoed beyond its walls, awakening something buried deep in the heart of Greywood. The wounds left by the steel vipers were real, but now they stood not only as reminders of what had been endured, but proof of what could be overcome. Proof that resilience wasn't some distant dream. It was already here, walking among them in boots and aprons, small gestures and shared glances, whispered thanks and steady hands. Darra Valen's journey was far from over. But tonight, as the cool air kissed her face and the street behind her stretched quiet and long, she walked away from the diner knowing she was part of something that would outlast even the hardest nights. Greywood had been broken, but now it was healing. And she had become its heartbeat.